I was on the stage the very first time at the age of 6, and I was a little guitar player. I could barely reach over the guitar, and
Very
and
good.
I fell in love. Yeah, and I fell in love with performing, and
What was your relationship like with your teachers?
through most of grade school and all through the end of high school, I hated every single minute of every single day of school.
What did you learn about yourself?
The thing that I learned most about myself is that there's an enormous amount of information in the universe of which I am completely unaware.
Steve, tell us at what stage in your life did you find yourself and what relationship had to break to discover yourself?
Oh boy, when I found myself, that's a tough one because I keep finding myself over and over and over again. And in a way, John, that's true, because the relationships that I've had in my life have defined those chapters in my life. And so I become a different person with each chapter, which is significantly defined by the relationship. And I got to tell you, I love this question because nobody's ever asked it. I've never thought of it before. So I love that when what's sort of just coming through is organic. So let me just walk through this. So in my younger stages of life, I was on the stage the very first time at the age of 6, and I was a little guitar player. I could barely reach over the guitar, and
Very
and
good.
I fell in love. Yeah, and I fell in love with performing, and of course, the relationships that drove my life back then were my parents and my family and that kind of thing. And so I remember being very young, and I was a very shy young man. And, because I had big, thick glasses, I was smaller than most of the other boys my age. But when I would get on the stage, I was in command, and I really enjoyed that experience. And so during my younger years, it was really my relationship with being in front of an audience was what really where my comfortable place was. Then when I got into my teenage years, I had a band, and I was not the lead singer in the band, but I was the front man. I was the guy in the band who worked with the audience. And so my relationships then, of course, were my friends, but I think the driving relationship again was with the audience and with being in front of an audience, even though we were playing in some of the worst, dirtiest, scuzziest bars and pubs and across the nation. Anytime I was on the stage, I felt like that was my comfortable place, because I was confident there and I wasn't confident anywhere else. And then what happened was, I watched a videotape. I guess I was around 19 or 20 years old. And I watched a videotape of Zig Ziglar, who I'd never heard of before. I don't even know how I found that videotape. And I thought, that's the most amazing job I've ever seen. Like this guy, he's on the stage, he's in front of an audience, he's got no equipment, he's got no bandmates, his audience isn't drunk as far as I can tell. I mean, and he's having a ball. And I thought, what a great job that would be. And so I started building professional relationships at that time, and I started exploring this concept of speaking, and I joined a company called the Dale Carnegie Training Organization, and I learned how to do it professionally there, and I became an instructor with them, and then I left them. But I think it was in my early to mid 20s maybe when I started developing professional relationships, and I don't think I was doing it deliberately. It just kind of happened by itself. And so that defined the launching chapter of my life for speaking and being a speaker coach and all those things. And then there were two other major relationships that defined very specific chapters in my life. And I'm going to say three. One of them was when my daughter was born. So my relationship with my daughter, and when I look back at it now, it feels like that's when I grew up. Right. And what I learned is that nothing makes you grow up like a child, like having a child. So that really set a trajectory of my life on how do I be a father? How do I be a good parent and all of those things? But there were two others. I married a woman in my 30s, in my early 30s, and I was with her for 18 years. And it turned out that during that period of life, she was struggling with very severe mental and emotional illnesses, of which I was unaware before we married. And that was a very difficult, very, very hard, very unhappy time of life. But in retrospect, what that chapter of my life did and what that relationship did is it taught me more about life than I had learned in the previous 30 years. And it was very difficult. But what I say is it prepared me, that chapter prepared me for my current chapter, because now I'm married to Jane and we've been together 9 years now. We've been married 5. And that has set a whole new chapter in my life. And that particular relationship with Jane is, as I think you know, is it's brought me all over the world. She's taught me even more about life than I would ever hope to know. And we have friends and relationships like you now all over the planet because of that one relationship with Jane. And so when I look back on my life in terms of relationships, it's very interesting because I can see where the relationships in my life define that chapter of my life, and each chapter is getting better and better and better and better in terms of my personal growth. So that was a big answer to a small question.
It's a very in-depth answer there, Steve. Thank you very much for all that information. So my experience of life has been that I got my first pair of glasses when I was 2 years of age. I had a turn in my eye. And all through my school life, I was regarded as being a bit different, particularly in primary school, because I wore glasses. And did you find that wearing glasses in school was an inhibitor to making friends, or that people say, this guy is different, we better leave him out of the crowd?
Absolutely. And like you, I started wearing glasses when I was 2. I had surgery on my eye. I have one eye that turns in. And I had to wear a patch on my, I have a good eye and a bad eye, right? So my right eye is my bad eye. So I had surgery on my right eye. I had to wear a patch on my left eye for 5 years, 7 days a week for 5 years. And that was a difficult thing because, people would ask me, kids, because kids don't know what to say. So, I got called four eyes and all of those things, and pirate and who poked your eye out and all of this stuff that kids do to each other. So that definitely, wearing glasses and having the patch was definitely a learning experience for me, for sure.
And how did your parents advise you as you were going through school to overcome these inhibitions that were being put in your way?
Yeah, well, so my father was a police officer. And in fact, all of my uncles and cousins are all police officers or have been. They're retired or are gone now. But I'm the only adult male in my entire family never to have been a police officer. So my dad's philosophy was this. When I started growing up and kids, started picking on me, my dad said, and you couldn't get away with this today, John, but my dad said, if some kid picks on you, you just punch him right in the face. You punch him in the face and you keep punching until he's crying, and he's crying good, And so that was my dad's philosophy. So I was an itty bitty little guy. And so that's what I would do. Little kids would pick on me and I just punch them, right? And so in about grade 5 or 6, a young man named Angelo Camposarconi broke me of that habit very quickly because he called me a name. I punched him in the face and he beat the tar out of me, And so he broke me. Then, of course, we became friends, and I led a less violent life since then. But that's how my dad taught me to do it. I'm not sure that was the right method at the time, but as a police officer, on the street, he was always having to protect himself, and he wanted me to protect myself. And so over the years, I took martial arts to learn how, because I was playing music in really mean bars with bad people in them. So I took some martial arts and I'll, learn how to protect myself and all those things. I've never really had to do that very much. But that, I think there was the whole thing of wearing glasses that put me in a position where I needed to learn how to defend myself one way or the other. So I guess in looking back, that was probably a good thing.
Yeah. My own father was a police officer also.
Oh, wow. We have so much in common, you and me.
I didn't notice until today, but there you go. But I found with my dad, he was very correct. And he was always kind of saying to us, don't do anything that will cause, shame on yourself or cause problems for yourself. So in other words, I'd be more reticent to speak up for myself during my early adult life and teenage years. So I kind of struggled in that regard. And what I found was one day we were doing PE in school, in secondary school this is, and my classmates recognized that I had a talent for athletics. And then all of a sudden, no longer was I the person on the outside looking in. They wanted me in their team then because they needed a leg up themselves, of course, and they saw, we'll use John because of his ability in athletics as part of the relay team. So I became part of the crowd eventually, slowly but surely.
Hmm.
In terms of your school life, what was your relationship like with your teachers?
Oh boy. Oh boy, that's okay. So here's the thing. Through most of grade school and all through the end of high school, I hated every single minute of every single day of school. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that, John. One is because I was very immature. I didn't grow up until much later in life, so I was very immature. Um, but I was one of those long-haired, greasy kids. I wasn't a bad guy. I never caused problems. I didn't do drugs. I didn't smoke. I didn't drink heavy. I wasn't a bad guy. I just had a very poor self-image of myself, and so I didn't really take very good care of myself. And there were a number of relationships in high school, but there were two memorable ones. One of them is a very powerful memory. It's a teacher named Mr. Cummings. He was my English teacher. And of course, I was failed almost everything or barely passed everything. I did just enough to pass. But he called my mother one time. I guess I was in grade 10. He called my mother one time and he brought her in to speak to her. And he said, your son is illiterate. He's functionally illiterate. He can't read, he can't write. And so he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with Stephen. That's what they all called me. I'm going to work with Stephen every day after school for an hour. And I'm going to teach him how to read and write. Now, my mother, and she said, I want you to, my mother gave my mother these instructions, buy him these books. So she bought me these books. And I was kind of forced to go to see Mr. Cummings every day, at a certain time, 5 days a week for, must have been 2 months. Like it was a long time. And of course, I hated every minute of it. But I got to the point, John, where I could pick out sentence structure and grammar errors in a magazine article or in a newspaper or in a book. I became a master of grammar and a master of sentence structure. Now, I still can't spell my own name, but but I can pick out these things. Now, I didn't realize the value of that then. And it was about, oh boy, I guess I was in my 30s and I was on a contract teaching at a local business college. And this story had come up, and I don't remember why it came up, but I remember telling the class this. And it occurred to me that I had never appreciated Mr. Cummings. Like, he didn't have to do that. Like, that was so far above and beyond any teacher's duty. So I thought, I want to see if he's still at the school. So I called the school and he was still there. He was just about to retire. So I went and I took him out for lunch and I told him the impact that he'd had on my life and that I'd never expressed gratitude and how grateful I was for him and the extra effort. And now, because of Mr. Cummings, I'm a 3-time #1 international best-selling author because of what he taught me. Now, he's gone now, but that relationship was one of those relationships, just like, my ex-wife, where you don't really appreciate the value at the time, but afterwards, the value becomes apparent. And what I've learned from that, John, is we need to value every relationship that's in our life, whether it's a happy one, a comfortable one, a toxic one, or not, because we grow from every relationship. So that was the main relationship in high school. My relationship with my teachers were okay because I wasn't a problem child. I just didn't do the work. There was one other kid in high school who was another one who picked on me, and I did something that took care of him one day, and that kind of brought me from being the little wimpy guy to somebody people didn't mess with anymore, like that kind of thing. But the significant relationship was Mr. Cummings.
And again, like yourself, I struggled with languages in school, in particular English, because I was too happy to read Shoot, which was a football magazine, or the sports pages on the Sunday newspaper. And it was only later in life when my brother Mark bought me one of those James Patterson thrillers that I began to read for leisure. And I moved from reading James Patterson thrillers into reading the likes of the Bronte classics, Charles Dickens. And then I got a love for the English language. But even today, I have to think very carefully about what I put on paper because I struggle with putting my idea on paper to this day. But that's life. Everybody has their strengths. Everybody has their weaknesses. Yeah. In terms of the workplace, you've mentioned there a few minutes ago that you were a Dale Carnegie trainer. And that reminds me of Barbara Moynihan from the Ireland region here. She was also a Dale Carnegie trainer. What did you learn about yourself in terms of dealing with people and building professional networks and building professional relationships in terms of being that Dale Carnegie trainer?
Well, that's an interesting story as well, because here's what happened with the Dale Carnegie thing. I went to them as a student because originally because I wanted to learn more about speaking. I wanted to build my confidence. I just all the whole package. I wanted to do those things, and I took all of their courses, and then I went to work for them in their sales department here in my hometown. But what would happen is my objective was always to become a trainer. So I would go to all of the classes as what's called a graduate assistant, where I'd sit at the back, and I would, what I would do is in my head, I would watch the instructors coach, and in my head, I'm coaching. And I remember thinking to myself with these other trainers, I would say, oh, I wouldn't have done it that way. Oh, yeah, I did it that way. Oh, yes, I would have done the same thing. Oh, I don't like that. And in my head, I was always coaching. And so one day, one of the instructors came to me and said, would you like to try coaching somebody? And I said, yes, I would. So I get up as the first time I've coached anybody, and it was the most difficult participant in the class. This person was a big, scary guy. He didn't want to be there. His boss forced him to be there, and he never broke through. Like, he barely participated. So he got in front of the class, and I had him in very short order, like in a minute or less. I had him opened right up. And he never reverted back. And so I remember thinking at that time, I'm good at this. This is what I want to do. And so I pursued becoming a Dale Carnegie instructor. But what happened in reality, John, is I went through all the steps to be the instructor. I wrote all of the things they wanted me to write. I went and did all the training. But the problem I had was in the back of my mind, I didn't agree with about half of what they were teaching. And I don't know why I didn't agree with it. It just didn't feel right. And so when it came time for me to actually sign the contract to sign, there were some elements in the contract that I couldn't abide. And so I put the pen down and I said, I can't sign this contract. And so I was trained as the instructor, but I didn't sign the contract. And so what I did was I left Dale Carnegie and went on my own and started teaching things the way I felt they should have been taught. But the cool thing that happened there, John, is when that's about the time, it was a little while later, maybe 5 or 10 years later, I got into this not a bad marriage, but the marriage with the lady with the mental illness. During that time with her, I was studying the brain. I wanted to understand what was going on in her brain so that I could figure out all of these strange behaviors that she had. But what would happen is I would read all of these books about trying to figure out what's going on with her. And I'd learn something about how the human mind works. And I would say, oh, that's why audiences respond that way. Oh, that's why you shouldn't have that body language when you're a speaker. Oh, that's why you need to say things this way. And I started validating with science all the things that I suspected, but didn't really know why I suspected. Now to get back to your question, during all of that time, one of the things that being with Carnegie did teach me to do is how to build professional networks. So I'll go back to your question is, as I represented Dale Carnegie, I would go to all the service clubs, all the Lions clubs, the Kiwanis clubs, all of the clubs, the chambers of commerce and all of those things. And I would be the Dale Carnegie spokesperson. So I would get speaking spots at all of these places. And it was great because I got to hone my craft. I got to become known in my area as a decent speaker. I get to make all kinds of connections because at those service clubs, the Lions clubs, the Kiwanis club, the Rotary club, all of those clubs, they're all business people. They're all connected. A lot of them are retired. A lot of them are just coming up in the business and everything in between, but they're all connected. And so I made so many professional connections during those years that it really set a good foundation for me to launch my own speaker training business.
Yeah, I had my own experience of Dale Carnegie training, and a man recommended that I read that book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. But what I gleaned from that book was, and one was a major life lesson for me, was to call people by their proper name. Because throughout my, say, early adult life, I had a terrible habit of assigning nicknames to people, and that can be hurtful. And also to appeal to noble
the nobler motives.
Yeah, motives. Yeah. Yeah, correct. That was another learning for me. Then you talked about your first marriage and all the issues you had from that marriage. What did you learn about yourself, as a person, both as a professional person and a, person in your own right from that
Yeah.
first marriage?
I think the thing that I learned most about myself is that there's an enormous amount of information in the universe of which I am completely unaware. Right? I don't know it all, and we sometimes we go through these periods of life where we just think we know it all, right? And I went into that marriage not quite at that stage, but I I wasn't prepared for what I was about to experience. I had never experienced anybody with mental illness. I didn't understand it. I didn't even know that what she was going through even existed. There was no sign of it prior to the marriage. Like it's like I married one woman one day and she was somebody else the next, and I never saw the one I married again after that. Now, when I look back in retrospect, I could see that there were signs that I recognize now, but didn't recognize them then. And so it taught me that just because I don't understand what I'm seeing doesn't mean that it's not important. And so it taught me that. It also taught me to have some compassion, because for a long time, I thought her radical behaviors and suicidal tendencies were just attention-getting tactics and manipulative tactics. And oftentimes they were. I'd say 90% of the time they were. But there's that 1%, right, or 10% of the time when it's real. And I needed to learn that sometimes the pain that people are exhibiting is real, and it requires compassion, and it requires understanding, and it requires support, and it requires tolerance, and all of those things. So I learned that about myself. And so what I try and do now when I encounter somebody with familiar behaviors, I try and lean towards that side instead of the judging side. So I learned that, but I also learned about my own resilience, because when people saw what we were going through, even her own family told me that I had to leave the marriage because my health was failing. And that's the reason I finally left the marriage, is because I had to. I was sick. I had, ulcers. I was having heart problems, and my life was going down, and I was no good to either of us by that time. So I had to, from my own survival, I had to. So I learned that I can be pretty resilient, and I can start over again, right? So I started over again, and from that life I left with what was in my car. And then I took care of her financially for 5 solid years after that. And she's fine now. She's doing well now. But I learned those things. I think, I learned how to be compassionate with people. I learned that I can be resilient, that I can start over. And I've learned that just because I don't know it to be true doesn't mean that it's not true.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And I'm a single man myself, never being married. But anyway, I've had a relationship that broke myself, which was a relationship with accountancy for 25 years, where I knew my own heart and mind it wasn't the right profession for me, but I just couldn't find the wherewithal to say to my parents, myself, even my professional colleagues at work, I'm in the wrong job. I need help to get out of this. And eventually it was made redundant, as fired in US terminology, from my job. And I had to find a new career for myself. And just going back there to what you were talking about a few minutes ago there, Steve, you were talking about Lions clubs, Rotary clubs. I'm at that stage where I'm going out to those clubs, to Toastmasters clubs also, PSA regions, to really practice and hone my keynote. So my final question for you is, you met Jane 9 or 10 years ago, you're married for 5 years. How has being married and meeting Jane really benefited your career,
Oh
personally,
boy.
professionally?
It's beyond measure. And here's why. First of all, Jane and I, we have the same aspirations in life. We want to go in the same direction. And I think that's a big fundamental piece of this. We obviously we don't agree on everything, but we both want to go to the same place. So that's huge. We have similar backgrounds in that we understand each other. We each came from challenging situations, bring this together. So we each have commonalities that we bring together, and we have lessons learned that we can join with each other. And we also have complementary skills. So my skill is not business. My skill is getting people on the stage and pulling magic out of them that they never knew was there, and helping. And that is really my gift. Jane's gift is she's a visionary, and she's also an excellent business person. She ran her own 8-figure business for 20 years and then retired from it in 2010. So she's got a lot of business acumen, a lot of business smarts, a lot of business savvy. And she's a risk taker. And I am less of a risk taker. So she's taught me how to be more of a risk taker. And so with all of those things combined, we brought, when I met Jane, I was doing okay. My business was kind of like this, and I no matter what I did, I couldn't get it over the hump. It was okay, but it wasn't great. And since I've met Jane, I've been all over the world, as you probably know. I live in a beautiful, beautiful home on the river, in some of the most prized areas in our city. We have a lifestyle business. I'm here in my studio at my home, as you are, and we just have a really great life. So personally, in every regard, it has elevated my life far beyond what I ever thought would even ever be possible for me, and far beyond what I ever thought that I would deserve. And so what that kind of tells me is two things come to mind. Number one is, like I said before, all the past relationships where the challenges are, pardon me, and where all of the torment is, and all of those things. That's what made me ready for Jane, because I wouldn't have been ready for Jane 20 years ago. But I'm ready. It built me up and made me ready for this relationship that we have. And I'm learning every day. How do we manage this relationship to the best of both of us? So that's my answer to the question.
That's a great answer. And to summarize today's conversation with Steve, what I found today is listening to Steve is, number one, resilience is so important in life because it makes us stronger. It gives us more conviction. Also, don't be afraid to find your purpose. And I think you did, Steve, early on in your life when you got up on stage and you found your voice, either as a musician and then later in life as a speaker. And the third takeaway from today's conversation is, if you want help in life, find somebody who's going to have complementary skills to yours. You don't want somebody who's going to say yes to everything you think or believe. You have to have somebody in your life who's going to say, perhaps you need to look at this from a slightly different angle, or you need to take a risk or two. And you did that in finding Jane and becoming life and business partners. So this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time today, Steve.
Well, John, it's such a privilege to get to hang out with colleagues from all around the world like yourself. And anytime I can provide value to you and your audience, you know how to find me.
I was with first boyfriend. We went to his house and his father said, "Who's this?" And my then boyfriend said, "This is the fortune teller's daughter." My dad was a fortune teller, John, and my identity was the fortune teller's daughter. And his dad said, "What is her name?" That was the first time I can remember being asked what my name was. So that was a pivotal moment. I then realized I had an identity outside of the tag that I'd been given.